I am looking at the next lesson realm, which is week 5. And if you have a handout there from last week, that lesson we've been looking at on the favor of God from Esther chapter 5. So, like we normally do, I'm going to read a little bit from Esther chapter 5, and then we'll review a little bit about the lesson we looked at last week, and then just take a minute to pray, and then get into our lesson here this evening. And hopefully it'll be a help as we kind of work our way through and we can have a conversation around these concepts a little bit together tonight as well. All right, so I'm in Esther 5, and I'm going to start reading here in verse 1, and hopefully you'll be able to hear me and hear me well. All right, Esther 5, verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. And then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom." All right, let me pray, and we'll get into this lesson together, okay? Father, thank you so much for our church family. Thank you that I can connect with them here tonight, although I'm here at a distance. Lord, I just ask you to help us as we work our way through this lesson this evening. Pray to encourage our hearts, strengthen us in your word. Lord, help us to be people that understand you better. Thank you for this time together in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen. All right, so I hope reading those few verses brought back some memories of last week, what we were looking at together. We were talking about how to ask sometimes someone in authority a difficult question and what that looks like. And sometimes we kind of went over last week, sometimes we have some really big decisions in life that we have to make. Sometimes we hit these times where we don't know what to do. We feel like life is in chaos. I'm sure like Esther did in different moments and just kind of struggling through, hey, what do I do? How do I handle that? How do I handle this situation? And what am I going to do to handle this with, like she did, with someone in authority? And she had this big petition, this big thing that she had to ask the king. And we kind of walked through how to do that. We talked a little bit last week about what are some of the big questions sometimes we ask, and some of those sometimes that we struggle through, or sometimes maybe, who should I marry? Should I get married? What job should I have? Where should I live? What house should I buy? What car should I buy? And sometimes we hit these really big questions, and sometimes they're a lot more stressful even than that. And you throw in all the different health issues at times that we deal with, and maybe what style of treatment we should do, and we just don't always know. We don't always know what God wants us to do. And so when Esther had to go into the king, when she had this big question she had to ask, when she was in a time of great stress, that's what we looked at. We start on that. Number one, there, if you have the notes, we looked at Esther's petition of the king. And how did she ask this huge petition? And the first thing that we looked at, letter A, was she did it prayerfully. And just we tried to talk a little last week about, hey, big decisions have to be bathed in prayer. And that old expression, I don't know where it came from, of taking a bath in prayer, but it's the idea that, hey, big decisions just ought to have prayer surrounding it all the way along. Because we talked about, like a lot of us, like Esther probably would have been, we get stressed. Situations like what Esther maybe was dealing with make us very terrified, very fearful. We make reactionary decisions, and decisions that sometimes are really painful, but aren't necessarily the right ones. So we really got to calm down. We really have to pray through things and make sure we do things properly, and make sure we do that as we make big decisions. We also talked about how Esther's decision at letter B was deferential, and just the reality that, hey, she didn't show up there with an attitude like, hey, I've been wronged, I've been hurt, I've been wounded, I've been mistreated, and hey, I've got a bone to pick with the king. Obviously, that probably wouldn't have gone real well. And, she didn't act like that. And instead, the Bible tells us there that she came, she seems to have waited. She dressed in such a way that showed respect for the situation. And really, when she came in that, she got what was absolutely necessary there in verse number 2. She obtained favor in his sight. And if you remember last week, we talked a little bit about, hey, sometimes someone's heart needs to move. Sometimes we need favor in a situation, but honestly, there's nothing we can do except pray and ask God to work in someone else's heart. And sometimes you're going to have a big thing happen in your life, and there's going to be a big person sometimes in their decision that's going to make a huge impact. Maybe, you're applying for a job and you really feel that, hey, I really think this is what God has for me, but you can't move that thing forward unless God moves the heart of the person that's hiring. And we need to ask God for his will. And maybe it's not God's will for us to get that job, but we definitely need to ask God, hey, God, would you move in the heart of the people that I can't do anything about so that your will would be done? And I think you really see that happening here in the life of Esther. And we see some different ways there that she showed her respect. We talked about that royal dress. We talked about a calm demeanor. She was out there waiting instead of rushing. We talked about some different reasons Esther could be calm in the face of danger, and some just a good reminder that, hey, we need to have that as well. And then we kind of talked about the conclusion of where that went. We talked about that she did get to the place that she was favored, and she was given the favor that she needed. And we kind of remember from Proverbs 21 and verse 1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. Okay, and that's going to bring us to number 2, which is our lesson for tonight. And we're going to talk about, on one hand, okay, when something big is happening, when a petition needs to be made, we need to be prayerful, we need to be respectful. But kind of the second big ingredient of what happened here is that Esther, while she was being very prayerful, she also had a very clear plan as to what she was going to do and how she was going to handle the situation. She knew more of an ask needed to be done. The first ask was what? Whether or not she was going to find favor in the king's sight. But that really wasn't what she was dealing with. That really wasn't the major problem. The major problem was, hey, Haman's plotted to kill the Jews. Haman's plotted to take all the lives of my people, and I need the king to do something about that. And so that brings us to number 2, which is Esther's plot regarding Haman. And how is she going to deal? Okay, and this is going to be kind of our question for tonight. How is she going to deal with someone that has power, that has influence, but is a very difficult person to deal with? Now, I'm going to ask this question. I hope you guys can help me there a little bit from a distance. Okay, but we're talking about difficult people here just for a minute. And I want to ask you the question, what are some of the difficult people that we might deal with in life? Brother Doug, do you have a microphone there? Maybe you can hand it around a little bit, because I want to hear, what are some of the difficult people we might deal with in life?
I do.
All right, so I can see if you're raising your hand.
Sorry?
Brother Doug, you're going to have to help me just get somebody for me if you
Okay.
can. What are some difficult people that we might deal with? And don't say your pastor.
No, no, I'm just asking if you want to name names, that's all.
Maybe your coworkers or your bosses.
Okay, for sure. Coworkers, bosses might be difficult people at different times.
Satan?
Oh, I didn't quite hear that one. What was it, Cherish?
Satan?
Satan.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Well, what's some challenging people? I got coworkers, got bosses. You
Some
guys must have a lot of nice people,
some
or everyone's
difficult
just mic
mother-in-laws.
shy tonight.
Some
Pardon?
some difficult mother-in-laws.
Oh
Mother-in-laws.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Family members, sometimes family members that are real strong and have a real strong mentality.
A police officer with a chip on his shoulder or a politician with a chip on their shoulder?
Yeah, some people in certain positions really can be power hungry. I was at Shoppers Drug Mart this morning, right there at Queenston Centennial. And it was 8 o'clock in the morning. The doors were just opening up, and the lady that was opening the door was not very impressed as to how many people were at the door. So she kind of started by telling everybody to back up and go away. So, but I mean, it's just like nobody was coming through that door. until she let them through the door. And she just was, I guess, didn't like the way the day was started. But sometimes people like power, and sometimes people use that power when they can. Anybody else? Any difficult people we might deal with? Because this is what we're kind of talking about. All right. Here is Esther, and she's dealing with a very difficult situation, but most importantly, she's dealing with a very difficult person, and that person is Haman. What do you do? And sometimes people deal with difficult people differently. Some people just go head on. Hey, I'm just gonna meet force with force. If they're gonna yell, I'm gonna yell. All right. If they're gonna get angry, if they're gonna push their weight around, I'm gonna push my weight around. Some people do that. Some people do nothing. Some people just run and hope that that person will go away and someone else will eventually deal with them. Honestly, in this situation, no one's doing that. Haman's got a lot of influence. He's got a lot of control. The king's not stopping him. It looks like if Esther doesn't step in, he could get his way and kill all the Jews. So what does she do? And we see, first of all, that she had a big prayer, okay? But then we're trying to look at tonight, secondly, she had a big plan. And that plan here, first of all, is Esther, letter A there. Esther requests Haman to a banquet, all right? Esther requests Haman to a banquet. Now, this is all part of kind of what occupies a good chunk here of Esther chapter 5, of Esther trying to get her concept, her request brought across, but she doesn't do it quickly. And for whatever reason, we'll see she doesn't just invite these people to one banquet, but she invites the king and Haman to two different banquets, and kind of looking at the why as to why is this happening. Hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense as we work our way through this passage. But when you go to Esther chapter 5 and verse 4, what is her request? When this petition, all right, Esther, you can have up to, the king says, half the kingdom. The sky's the limit. Let me give you a blank check. You just tell me what you want. She doesn't just announce. There's a couple reasons why she might not announce right at that moment. I think one, it would have embarrassed the king if something was happening under his nose that needed to be reversed. Right? It could have, if she would try to deal with it in the courtroom with everybody else there, it could have had some really bad results. It could have been a situation where she just didn't feel the timing was right. My kids kind of laugh at my house. Last night when I was getting ready to go, getting ready to pack up the evening, one of the kids had asked me something, and one of the other kids kind of responded, that, oh, I don't know if they've learned the rule yet. You don't ask dad until he's had supper. Because if daddy hasn't had supper yet, then, I might not be ready, to take on a big, you might not get the answer that you're looking for, was kind of the laugh of the other kid. And I think Esther kind of knew there was a timing as to when she should ask this if she wanted to get the answer that she was looking for. So Esther responds, Esther 5 verse 4, and Esther answered, if it seemed good unto the king, and let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Now, the king has got to know there's something bigger at play here. Esther does not risk her life. She does not walk into the throne room just to ask for a lunch date, okay? He knows something big is going on, but he doesn't know what it is yet. And so they come, and Esther has been looking at that prayerfully as she's been praying over the last several days. I'm sure she's also been thinking about what she's going to do. She's praying about how to handle this situation. And she's also thinking about, can I make this statement? Hopefully it'll help you when it comes to making different big decisions in your life. Prayer time can also be good planning time. And what I mean by that, if you say, I'm going to take 3 days to pray about this situation. And I'm going to pray for God to work in the situation. But secondly, I'm going to ask that God would give me wisdom in this situation. And sometimes it's really neat to see God bring an idea or a plan to your mind that you might not have thought of yourself. And sometimes we have a tendency when we're rushing, when we're stressed, when we're maybe irritated, that we jump to a decision, but we're not necessarily prayerfully doing something that God has given us to do, but we're just doing something that comes as a reaction to us. So I'd encourage you at different times. It's good as we sit back and we pray. You say, I'm going to take 3 days to pray with us. I'm going to take a week to pray about this, whatever it may be. At the same time, be using that time to say, hey, God, what would you want me to do? And how do you want me to handle this situation? Because sometimes we rush in handling people. Sometimes we rush in handling challenging situations. And sometimes we make some really bad calls in doing so. And so Esther here is not just making a decision. She is looking to God at the same time for what she should do. And I kind of wonder if, as she's going through this, that God gives her a good plan as to how to handle a very delicate situation. You see that Esther 5 verse 5, it says, the king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Verse 6, and the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? So he knows there's got to be something bigger going on here. What is thy petition? What is thy request? It shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. All right, she's saying, if you'll come tomorrow, I'll tell you. If you'll come again, I've got another request. Would you come again? And let her be there in your notes. If you got a copy of your notes there, Esther requests a second banquet. Esther requests a second banquet. Now, I want you to think here with me for a minute, and maybe if I can get a couple people on the mic to kind of jump in with me. Why do you think maybe might be some of the reasons? The Bible doesn't tell us for sure, but I kind of wonder, the Bible includes this for us. What are some of the reasons that Esther may not have talked to the king about it the first time? Why is it that, Esther didn't bring up right in this situation that, hey, Haman has decided to kill the Jews, and hey, anyone have any ideas as to why this may not have come up at this first meeting? I think it's an interesting consideration from this passage. Brother Doug, I can't see you. Is anybody got anything?
Larry's got one.
All right. Appreciate it, Larry.
She was fearful. She might have been
Fearful
of what would happen if she brought it right out in the open. She wanted to wait till the time was right. And the time was right at the second banquet.
All right. I think that's very possible. She could have been very fearful of the situation. Sometimes, you plan to deal with something. Have you ever had that in your life before? Sometimes you're like, you know what? I'm going to have a conversation with someone. We're going to talk about this. And you sit down for a cup of coffee, and somehow you have a really hard time getting to that conversation. It's good. So she might have just been fearful. And what else? Why do you think she didn't bring it up on that time?
Maybe one meal was of the foods that from there, and one meal was going to be Jewish foods, so he sees both sides of life.
No, could have been. The Bible doesn't tell us. Interesting consideration. I think there's many situations in which, and the Bible, I think, includes this for us to help us understand, one, the delicateness of the situation. And for whatever reason, for some reason, the timing just wasn't right. And Esther, as she was sitting down there, she did not feel ready to have a very delicate conversation. And I'm including this because I think there's a very clear human aspect of this. Because sometimes you're going to make a plan to do something, and a big conversation has to be had with someone. And maybe there's someone that's really giving you a problem in your life, or maybe someone that's really offended you. And you're like, you know what? I have to go and talk to them. And sometimes the first time you go to talk to them, you try and sit down with them, and you're planning to have this conversation. You want to have this conversation. And then maybe someone else walks into the room. I don't know what happened. Maybe there was too many servants around at the first time. And Esther just knew, man, I can't have this super delicate conversation with a whole bunch of people teaming around. I don't know what it was, but she knew it wasn't right. And I just want you, I hope when you realize that when you have to deal with really delicate situations, number one, ask God for a plan. God, give me wisdom as to how to deal with this, how to confront maybe a situation with love, how to have a conversation with someone maybe that's offended. But Lord, when that conversation happens, help me to sense when the timing is right. And I've had different moments in sitting down with people and just recognizing that, hey, there's a conversation we have to have. And sometimes I'll just prayerfully with God before I meet with them. Let's be like, Lord, if you want us to have this conversation today, would you open the door? Would you make it clear? Would you lead the conversation in such a way that it doesn't have to be unduly uncomfortable? Because sometimes when you're trying to deal with something that's delicate, complicated, something that's going to be hurtful, something that's going to be emotional, I just imagine, I know if I was in Esther's shoes, just opening the can of worms of that conversation. Can you imagine what that would have felt like? You got Haman on one side, the guy that did it, right? You know, depending on how this goes, he could be incredibly angry, incredibly defensive. He has the king's ear. He's been a major influence. On the other side, you have a king, and you realize the whole book is unpacking this. You have a king whose last queen, lost her position because she did something against the king. And you're trying to deal with the fact that, hey, this is going to be incredibly offensive to Haman. It could also be incredibly offensive to the king. And here I am in the middle. I've got to have this conversation. I can't let this go. The clock is running down. Man, I need to do something. What am I going to do? How am I going to handle this? And I'm going to pray, and I'm going to plan, and I'm going to posture, and I'm going to try and deal with this conversation so that I don't put my foot in my mouth, so I don't talk when I'm not supposed to talk. So I say what needs to be said clearly and lovingly. And man, it's so important when God gives us opportunities to have conversations with people, especially people at times that are giving problems or trouble. Reminds you of that verse, brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city. And sometimes when people's emotions are engaged, we so desperately want those conversations to go right. And I'm sure we've all been there. I'm sure there's been moments like some of the people that were brought up that we have to call a family member, and there's just been something really bad that's happened, or something really awkward or maybe there's been offense between them and another one of our siblings. We're trying to be the peacemaker, and we're just like, God, please help me to know what to say. Help me to know how to handle this. And I think you just really see a great example of Esther in this. She's waiting for the right time. She's being careful. She's trying to be as respectful as she can be. She's trying to communicate, even through this, I think, that she is not expressing hatred specifically towards Haman. She's inviting him into her life, into her house, but Haman is obviously doing the opposite. All right, and this is going to bring us to letter C. Letter C in this story. All right, what happens? All right, you're dealing with a delicate situation, dealing with a major problem person. And we're talking about having a plan, trying to deal with that carefully. And then I want to see this last concept here in this thought, and that's Haman's pride increases. Haman's pride increases. Now, I want you to consider this, okay, especially with problem people. Sometimes with problem people, there's a situation you have to deal with. Sometimes with other problem people, you need to allow them to make their bad motives and character apparent. And that's going to be a hard thing to understand, because in some situations with delicate things like this, there's conversations that we need to have with people. And sometimes when things are morally murky and ethically murky, because right now everyone's confused as to what's right. Is Haman right? Is Esther going to be right? But Haman is going to evidence in his behavior a lot of the reason, even because of what Esther did and how God sovereignly over all of these things was in charge of this situation, we're going to see that everything that happened increased the obvious nature of Haman's problem. And sometimes when people are doing wrong, sadly, people will do enough wrong that it will be evident to all. And then often in those situations, it can be dealt with. Sometimes it can be hard until some of these things come to the surface. So what do we notice here? What Haman's pride increases. We see, look, with everything that's happening, Esther is asking him to come to her home. She's asking him to come to a banquet. He's quite elated, as we're going to see here in scripture, at that possibility. He's feeling, pretty high on the horse at this point. The king gets to go. Haman gets to go. He feels like he's a pretty good. I'm not sure if it's in your notes, but here in mine from Warren Wiersbe, he said this: "What an honor for Haman to attend a special banquet with the king and queen alone in the queen's private apartment. It's unlikely that any official in the empire had ever been so honored. As Haman ate and drank with Ahasuerus and Esther, his confidence grew." And that's really what we're going to see in these next verses. Haman's confidence grows, but in such a way that his pride gets to a breaking point. And sadly, some sinful people, when they are given enough room to be the character that they are, will show to everyone the pain and the awfulness of their character. So what do we see that happened with Haman? We see there, number one, he hated Mordecai. So this is what happened. Esther 5 and verse 9, it says, and then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, then he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Now, what's happening here? The Bible's including this. All right. Haman goes from being elated emotionally to angry emotionally. You ever had anything happen in your life sometimes? You walk in the front door, something's broken, maybe you walk in the door, something's a mess, and you can go from having a really good day to a really bad day really quick. I don't know what your life's like. Every person's life is a little bit different. But sometimes we can go from being really happy to not very happy in a short period of time. And this is kind of what the Bible's portraying. Haman is super happy. All right. He is just top level excited himself at being able to be at Esther's place. And then right as he's leaving, this guy who has been the thorn in his side, Mordecai will not stand for Haman. And this just infuriates him. It says there in the Bible, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. I mean, he's just boiling with rage. So much so, as you read these verses, that Haman, although he's already put it into effect for all the Jews to be killed, it's like Haman can't even wait for the day to come, and he wants to set up some way to specifically take the life of Mordecai. It's just an awful evidence of the kind of man that he is. Number two there, what's happening in the emotions of Haman. Number two is he brags to his friends. And you see this in Esther 5, 10 through 12. It says, nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Jairus and his wife, and Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, and of the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come with the king into the banquet that she was prepared but myself. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Now, this is funny to me because Haman is really frustrated. He's really angry. But he goes home, and it's almost like he is trying to pacify and build up his own feelings about himself. He's like, hey, I'm great. I have so much riches. The king gave me this. The king gave me that. And it's almost like although something is bothering him, he's still trying to elevate his own ego. And this is all going to play into what? This is all going to play into the ego of Haman is going to lead to him being arrogant and tripping up. Now, I am not encouraging you to necessarily see someone that is a difficult person fall, but I do want to tell you this. Sinful people do not last forever. And when someone is being miserable, sometimes even someone is being miserable as a leader, the truth is, and for anyone that's lived any length of time, you will find eventually people's bad behavior catches up with them. And this is going to be Haman. Haman is bribing his way to the top. Haman is arrogant. Haman's biggest crisis in his life right now, painted in the Bible, is that somebody won't bow down to him. I mean, that's his big problem. And that's how full of himself he is. But when he's living life that way, eventually Haman's life is going to come crumbling down. And I'm saying this because we're asking this question: how do you deal with difficult people? You need to have a plan. You need to be careful as to how you execute that plan with God's wisdom and God's direction. But sometimes there's certain situations in which people's character will become really evident with time. And here, a Haman is not needing any help to show how petty, how small-minded, how frustrated he is, to the point that he is just revealing a very, very poor character. Proverbs chapter 6, maybe there in your notes, verses 16 through 19, just talks a lot about character that really evidences in Haman's life. It talks about a proud look. It talks about a lying tongue and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief. And quote there in your notes probably as well. It says, pride is the ground in which all the other sins grow, and the parent from which all other sins come. And, Haman had no problem, telling everybody how great he was. But eventually this crisis of character is going to come crashing down. And this is why I'm trying to encourage you when it comes to dealing with people that are maybe at work, there's someone that is just doing wrong. They're ethically being wrong. And you're like, I don't know if I should talk to my employer about this. I don't know if I should deal with this. And sometimes there's situations where you're like, you know what, I need to talk to someone. This needs to be dealt with. At the same time, sometimes there's things that are just completely unfair. That someone is getting away with something that they shouldn't be. Let me just encourage you that eventually people's character, and it might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, it might not be even 10 years from now, but eventually people's character does seem to catch up with them. And it's the way that it happened with Haman. I know in my life, I've seen it sadly happen with many people who seem to get away with their behavior for a period of time, but eventually that lifestyle caught up with them. That's number 3. And here you kind of see it come to this crisis. But Haman plans to kill Mordecai. He's just so infuriated. He's so petty. He's not going to wait. And here in Esther 5, verses 13 through 14, kind of towards the end of this chapter, it says, yet all this availeth me nothing, as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Now, what is that on the heels of? He's saying, hey, my life's so great. I get to go see Queen Esther. I get to have all the money. I've got family. I've got all these things. He says, but none of that is any good to me as long as I see Mordecai doing what he's doing. Verse 14 says, then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the king pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Now we're talking about eventually your pride becomes your downfall. Some of you know the story. What's going to happen with those gallows? Who can tell me? What's going to happen with those gallows that here Haman is going to build for Mordecai? Brother Doug?
Yes, that's correct. Haman.
Yeah, I couldn't quite. I must have just missed you. Yeah, Haman is going to be hanged on the same gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. This man with some majorly bad character problems. His pride went on the run, and his anger went on the run, and his wrath went on the run, and eventually it all caught up with him. And this is a tough thing with some people in power. Some people at times can get away with things for a long time and even get a lot of influence. But eventually, the Bible does say you reap what you sow. Eventually, the Bible says your sins will find you out. Eventually, these things become apparent. And when someone operates in wrath, it can be an incredible, display. Sadly, when someone walks away from that type of behavior. Quote here in my notes, might be in yours as well. No one to waste time. Haman ordered that the gallows be made. We're not sure whether the gallows itself was 75 feet high or whether it was put in a prominent place that lifted it up to that height, such as the city wall or the roof of the building. But here is Haman wanting to make a big display of Mordecai. And sadly, it's going to turn around right on him. Anger led him to make a hasty decision. One more verse tonight, and then I'm going to close things up, turn things back over there to Brother Doug. Proverbs 14 and verse 29. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalteth folly. Let's see if you can help me with one more thing, and then we'll close things up here. But what are some decisions? Haman made a really foolish decision when he got full of pride, when he got full of wrath. When it comes to relationships with people, what are some of the things that we might do if we're full of anger and we're full of wrath that might come back to bite us? What are some things? Can you think of anything? People are being quieter tonight.
You can burn bridges.
All right. Yeah, we definitely can burn some bridges with people, make things final and done, and it can be part of the challenge. But here's Haman, right? That's what he does. He allows his emotions to run. He goes and builds these gallows, and then eventually he's the one that has to suffer the punishment from them. How do you deal with difficult people? Haman was a difficult person, no question. He's full of bad character. He's full of bad wrath. He's in this situation that he's right in the middle of this terrible situation that Esther is trying to deal with. She's gone into the king. She's got this huge petition to ask to save her people. But in the middle of it, she has to deal with a very difficult person. And I just want to encourage you, all right, as you go through life, there's going to be moments where sometimes dealing with tough situations means dealing with difficult people. And you need God's wisdom for those moments. But at the same time, sometimes situations have to be allowed to go to the point that someone's character can be clearly and obviously revealed. And Haman did that, and eventually is going to be dealt with. But it was all part of the story of how God was able to save the Jewish people. All right, thanks, everyone. It's been wonderful to spend some few minutes with you this way. I will pass things over, Brother Doug, to you if you want to close in prayer and then maybe take some prayer requests tonight. That'd be great. I'm going to stay on. I'll just be able to listen to the call until the live stream is shut off. But appreciate y'all. Hope you have a wonderful night of prayer and fellowship. Thank you.